the Mishcon Academy digital sessions.
Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining this Mishcon Academy session. I'm Nadeem Mir, and I'm lucky enough to be hosting today's event. I also co-chair Mishcon's Race Equity Committee with the amazing Kizzy Augustine, who's sat over there. This event, I would say, is driven by Mishcon Embrace, which is our race equity network. So welcome, all of you. A warm Mishcon welcome to David. I'd like to welcome our incredible guest, David Olusoga. Now, David, apologies for mangling your name. I've tried my best. I know you're from Newcastle. My Geordie pronunciation is not very good. I'm sorry if I've got a
very hard accent.
Yeah, forgive me. David's produced a lot of works. One of the most famous is his book, Black and British. And like a good lawyer, you can see I've reviewed it and tabbed it up. There's so much material in this book. It's absolutely phenomenal. There's probably material for 10 or more Netflix and Disney Plus series. It's incredible. It's a masterpiece. Fantastic. Reading it was clear to me that there were two elements to that. So one is the history of black people within the UK, which goes back centuries and has been erased. The other is the history of Britain's expansion overseas and engagement with black people, where the bad bits are kind of being forgotten, let's say. There's something I want to talk to you about, something I've heard you discuss, which is this concept of pride and shame when it comes to history. You sort of described it as a way of, or what we should do is to leave pride and shame at the door of the Library of History, which I thought was really interesting. Could you expand on that for us?
Yeah, I think they're juvenile emotions to go into history with. The idea that history exists to make us feel good means that our transactional relationship with history becomes one in which the only thing we want from it is a pageant of heroes and victories and glorious chapters that make us feel good. And the reasons why I think those elements of history and many others have been airbrushed out, have been erased, pushed to the margins, or forgotten about is because they don't perform that function. It's now just not fit for purpose. This country is now 14% non-white. And I think we sometimes forget that every mixed race family, every interracial couple is also two extended families. The number of people who aren't counted in any statistic, but if you look at their extended family, it's diverse. I mean, if you look at people's the big photograph of the last family gathering, the christening or whatever, or the wedding, it's kind of getting rare that everybody in that picture will be of one race. So it was always dishonest. It was always incomplete. It's now just dysfunctional. Yeah. And I think what we're seeing is if history is not about pride and it's not about shame, well, what is it? And I think what it is it's about honesty. It's about completion. It's about looking at the margins, seeing what hasn't been written about. And we're in a long process. It began in the 60s with trying to make history more about working class people and about women. And trying to put the imperial and the racial elements back into history is just another phase within that history. We're trying to get away from what Thomas Carlyle did in the middle of the 19th century when he said history is about great men. It's not. History is about millions of different facets and aspects, but we're desperately trying to get away from that idea that unless you're talking about Napoleon or Churchill, it's not really history.
Yeah. You're living in Bristol.
Yeah.
One of your very, very famous neighbours moved recently in quite a public way, obviously talking about Colston and his statue. There are some people, I'm not one of them, who kind of question whether that was the right thing to happen. I think if most people who do have that sort of view, I think might change their mind if they knew the actual history, the forgotten history of the statue, who put it up and when, and maybe if you could elaborate on that. I know you were involved in the case as well.
Yeah, I was a witness in the court case, which was a kind of amazing privilege, and I think an amazing moment for Bristol. Someone's talking about whether they can make a drama out of the court case. I think two things strike me about what happened with that statue. The first is the people who removed it, the people who toppled it, were young people, and I think it speaks to a fundamental generational shift of attitudes, which underpins the moment we're living in. But the other thing was, I mean, I was pleased, I have to admit, when that statue was toppled, for two reasons. One is because I don't think we should celebrate mass murderers, but the other is because it's the
really controversial, David.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, it turned out.
What next?
Yeah, it turned out to be. But the other thing is it's the perfect statue for disproving what statues are and what they're not. because this idea that statues represent the truth and they represent real history, and therefore removing them is rewriting history, is the opposite of the reality. Statues are created in order to rewrite history. The statues themselves very, very often tell lies, and it was the perfect statue because it was full of falsehoods. Colston died. He was a Bristol-born slave trader who was for a brief while the deputy governor, which is the CEO of the Royal African Company. He was a shareholder for much of his life. He was a board member for much of his life. The Royal African Company transported more people into slavery than any company in British history. And he was, in his tenure, we think around 84,000 people were transported into slavery and 15,000 of them died. So he's complicit in 15,000 deaths and the enslavement of 84,000 people. First of all, it called him a wise and virtuous son. Wise, virtuous. Well, virtuous, he was a slave trader. Wise, the company lost its monopoly and went bankrupt. Well, the beginning of its bankruptcy began under his tenure. He wasn't even a very good slave trader. And he had very little to do with Bristol. He lived most of his life in London and Mortlake and Surrey. They also claimed the statue was put up by public subscription. Whenever you see that on a statue, erected by the people of wherever, it's very often not the case. And how many of us have been involved in putting up a statue or been asked about a statue? Statues are put up then as now by small elites, and they choose members from their own groupings and they erect the statues in their honour. And so it was the perfect statue. So the idea that it represents truth and history is demonstrably disprovable. The other thing is statues just fundamentally don't work. The idea that we remember things because of statues or place names, again, is demonstrably disprovable. We're not very far from the most important memorial landscape in this country, Trafalgar Square. Everyone knows one of the statues in Trafalgar Square. It's hard to miss. 60-metre pillar. We all know about Nelson. But there are 7 statues in Trafalgar Square. I've never met anyone who could name all 7. That's the most fundamental, the most celebrated memorial landscape in our nation, in the centre of our capital. Most of us have walked past those other statues dozens, hundreds of times, and we've never taken any notice of them because statues don't work. They're boring. They just don't function. They don't allow us to remember history, and the same with place names. The examples I always love to use is there are Portobello streets and Portobello markets and Portobello roads all over Britain. I love asking audiences, tell me everything you know about the Battle of Portobello. Which year, what war, who were we fighting? People have no idea because we don't remember things through statues and place names. We remember history through books. I'd like to think through television programs, through what we're taught at school. Statues don't function. But what they do function as is a battle line in a culture war. And that's what we're living through. It's not really about statues. The idea that people in government really care about statues.
So look, the more observant members of the audience will notice, David, you are indeed black. That means you have to deal with things that I'm guessing most historians don't have to deal with. I mean, I know you're regularly targeted. Fortunately, today you didn't feel the need to have a bodyguard with you, but I know that you sometimes have to. Would it be okay if you asked about that, kind of what you have to deal with and how you manage it?
I think when a nation, when you were in this a moment of generational shift, when we're not just asking people to rethink history, but to rethink the function of history. And if you're somebody who was brought up with a version of Britain and the British Empire that was glorious and only glorious, it's often much easier to attack the messenger than it is to challenge and self-reflect on your relationship with history. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a backlash against historians because what history is asking of people is a lot, is to take this thing that you think of only as self-validating and positive, and to recognize that actually it's much more complicated, much more nuanced, and a lot of it is very far from glorious and very far from comforting.
You know, people, you hear all the time, we won 2 world wars and 1 World Cup. I mean, but none of us kicked the ball, right?
Exactly.
Or fought in it.
Yeah. But as Gary Young and others have pointed out, we say us when it's about D-Day. We never say us when it's slavery. We'll say we won the war. We won't say we enslaved 3.5 million people in the North Atlantic. So it's only ever us when it's something glorious.
You can't have it both ways. You can't just have that bit and not that bit.
Exactly.
Just don't take any of it and just look at it as history.
And this is why I think pride and shame, both of them are kind of. just immature emotions to go in to slavery with, to the history with. But what's really interesting is, this idea of what's a mature relationship with history. The maturity, ironically, is to be found amongst the young. The people with a grown-up attitude towards history who never expect history to only tell them comforting stories are young people. So the very strange thing in this society is, if you want maturity, you look at people who are teens and 20s. If you want an immature relationship with history, you talk to people who are in the older demographics. And that speaks to just how profound what's happening is. We're not just expanding history, we're not just telling untold stories. We're in a moment when what history is there for is being radically rethought.
You collected an OBE earlier this year, and unquestionably to be offered an OBE is a massive recognition of your work, your contribution, your service to Britain. But for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do know, OBE means Order of the British Empire. Now, I'm assuming you're not a person with a kind of romanticised view of what empire was.
No.
But clearly it's a personal decision.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you have to grapple with it, or was it fine? Yeah,
absolutely. And what I did is I spoke to many other black people in the public eye who've had exactly the same debate. And it is what should be something lovely. It should be, your nation is saying, we recognise the work you've done and we want to honour you for it. What should be a sort of lovely thing where you just kind of phone your mom and then go down the pub is this awful moment of weighing up pros and cons. And it's appalling, and it speaks to a nation that has an immature relationship with its history. The question you have to ask yourself, and this was put to me by somebody I spoke to, I won't name, is, the question is, do you think black people in Britain need more or less influence? If you think we could do with less influence, again, I don't think you've been paying attention. So I think it's not just abhorrent, it's childish that we name our national honours after an empire that no longer exists. It's just silly at a fundamental level. It's also disrespectful to people for whom the empire means something very different because it's in their family history. But I look at the sort of the black people I admire who've been in this dilemma and the decisions they've made, and most people I admire have come down on the side of pragmatism. So I look at the list of people who've said yes, and it is, many of the people I admire most in Black Britain. You mentioned Idris earlier, Horace Ove, the filmmaker, Doreen Lawrence, David Harewood, Lenny Henry. Many of the people who I think have made enormous contributions to improving the lives and access and opportunities for people of colour in this country have had to weigh up, is this thing practically more useful than saying no, which might make me feel better? Yeah. Because I'm about change. And I don't think boycotts and symbolic gestures are fundamental to change. I think it's about working with young people. I think it's about making opportunities, and I think it's about fighting fights.
But it's clear the system needs to be modernised and decoupled.
Well, what I'm told, I've been told this for a few years now, is that it will be changed, and that it was the late Queen who was resistant to changing the system. And the rumour that circulates is that it will be changed to the Order of Elizabeth, which I think would be quite nice.
We've obviously had lots of inflection points in our social dialogue around the makeup of Britain and its relationship with people of different religions and ethnicities, etc. Do you think we stand any reasonable prospect of, as a whole British society, of kind of regularising our conversations around the mix of people in this country and how we interact with one another without future inflection points like the ones we've been through in recent years?
I think those inflection points will come, but I do think that, there's a phrase, there's a cliche. Not all cliches speak to truths, but the phrase is, demographics is destiny. And if you look at the attitudinal surveys on these issues around nationhood, around identity, around history, and you look at attitudes amongst the young compared to the old, there is an enormous change taking place. So in the long run, a society will inevitably move towards the attitudes of the young rather than the old. And I think you can see that working through not at a governmental level, but at an organizational level. There are dozens of companies I know of at the moment who are looking at their history. The momentum is there, but these histories have been buried for a long time. And the ideas that these histories have implanted into our society the racial ideas that still shape our society to an extent, they are hundreds of years old. So we're a few years into a kind of moment of recognition of this history and reflection on the legacy of ideas and stereotypes this history has left behind. And it took centuries for these ideas to be implanted into our society. I think it's going to take decades at least for us to work through the legacies of those histories as well as the recognition of those histories.
We're coming up to the hour and I want to finish on time, so if we haven't got any further questions from the crowd, I'm going to wrap it up. But just finish by saying, David, thank you. That was absolutely superb. It's a pleasure to have you. Thanks, David.
Thank you.
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.